Welcome to VMware's Multi-Cloud Podcast. My name is Eric Nelson, and today I have with me my co-host, David Jasso. David, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Eric.
Fantastic. Well, on the show today, we're going to be talking to Harmen VanderLinde. He's out of the CTO office. He is a senior architect, and we're going to be talking about observability in modern apps. David, why don't you introduce Harmen?
All right. Hey, Harmen. Hey, great to have you on the show today. Hey, Harmen, you're in the Octo group, so the office of the CTO. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about your role there and how you came to VMware and some of your background. It's really interesting, and I think our audience would love to hear about it.
Okay, David and Eric, thank you for the invite. Let me say that first. Very quickly about my role and maybe a little bit my background. I'm part of the, within Octo, we have different organizations, and I'm part of the cloud architecture team. I'm currently leading a newly formed team. It's the Cloud Data Platforms team. And in a nutshell, what we're doing is we're focusing on technologies that make it easier to deploy kind of distributed stateful applications like databases and in-memory compute systems on VMware cloud infrastructure. There's a lot of complexity there, and really what we're trying to figure out is how we can make it easier for our customers to deploy these distributed applications that are becoming kind of mainstream in many customer application deployments, what we've seen. I joined VMware last year, and I came from a Citigroup, and there I've been running the IT monitoring organization. It was kind of before the time of observability, so to speak, but still called monitoring. But certainly I think in my days, and I had a great team with me, we really implemented the whole observability solution for fairly large global Kubernetes infrastructure. And it was a great learning experience for me. Did it a number of years. And then before Citigroup, I was actually on the vendor side, similar to what I do now, and I was running a product management team in Cisco for a number of years. So I've been kind of going back between the vendor side and the end user side. So it started actually at AT&T for a number of years, where I was running the network management operations team for one of their large scale networks. And it's been a great journey so far. And I like both perspectives. It's good to see
awesome.
deploy things at the same time also build products. It has some very good synergy for me to kind of go back and forth.
Great. You came in with followed in Greg Lavender as our CTO. He came from Citi. You worked with Greg at Citi. That's right.
That's correct. Yeah, I've been following Greg. I've been following Greg since I think Cisco days.
Cool, awesome.
Hey, just a quick question before we go on history. Sure. Citigroup, from a scale perspective, it's like massive, right? Like, could you just give us a little bit of how big are some of these environments where you have VMs and applications running? Can you give us a scale of how big that operation was?
Yeah, absolutely. Although exact numbers, obviously, I cannot provide, but I can tell you it's definitely think in terms of hundreds and thousands, right? So it is very large. More importantly, also, and I think that's very typical for any large, certainly financial organization. There's a lot of different applications. There's thousands and literally thousands of business applications deployed on that infrastructure. So there's a lot of complexity that kind of comes along with it, right? And that's in addition to all the regulatory, security, and compliance requirements. But it has been, for me at least, but I think for many people, a very good learning ground, right? To really kind of understand not only how you deploy cloud technologies at scales, but also do it in such a way that it's compliant, right? And that is very hard. And I think for a lot of financials, it becomes harder, by the day, right? So there's a lot of good technology options, I think, out there in the market. But at the same time, making that translation of how you apply these technologies for the different industry segments of enterprises, that is actually where I think there's a lot of complexity. So certainly I've dealt with it quite a bit in Citigroup as well. So anyway, Eric, so definitely think about hundreds and thousands, right, of server host systems and what have you. So this is a large scale, no question.
Very, very challenging. Very challenging.
So Harmen, great training with Citibank on scale. We're talking today about observability and some of the work the team's been doing around observability and creating a new framework for it. You and I have had some conversations about observability. I've been involved in the enterprise management space for at least 15 years, and some of the distinctions around observability versus monitoring, to me, it's not so much there's a huge difference between the intention, but it's kind of what's changed to a great degree is kind of the scale of the problem, and then sort of who's the audience for it. Maybe you can talk about the differences between observability and monitoring as you see it, and what do you think are the big distinctions there?
Oh, absolutely, glad to. Just to give you a little bit of background, also on the white paper. The Octo architecture team has published actually a couple of, I think, very interesting white papers. But really, what we're trying to do is define a problem. So I think it clarifies, I think, the problem statement, and also at least drive an architecture view on top of it. And for observability, is a very similar approach we were taking. Observability has been a bit of a buzzword, to be frank, right? The last two years, and before observability, we had AI ops. Right, and you see a lot of vendors and I think industries that try to adopt the terminology without actually understanding what's going on and repeating kind of the same terminology. And I think that's not very helpful. So in a nutshell, we try to explain in the white paper really kind of the concept, but we think, from a VMware perspective, what really observability is all about and how you can implement it, right? And how it impacts in terms of how you implement, specifically, I think cloud, processes and what to have you, because it really kind of, I think, is very closely related to it. So what I usually do, right, to start, okay, what is observability? More importantly, how is it different to monitoring? Just to frame it, I usually define observability as a discipline where intelligence is applied to different types of telemetry data, and that then in turn, provides an input for automation, right, as well as kind of actionable outputs for decision making, right, by operations, but also by management, right? To me, that's the essence what it is. To me, it's all about actionable data. And the way I look at it, if you contrast observability against like traditional monitoring, I think observability is kind of, stepping in where monitoring left off, to put it in a simple way. Right, it's kind of a superset, and I think what happened is monitoring traditionally was about collecting some, specific set of telemetry data, typically in silos. So, for example, you would have a log collector, you would have a metrics collector, you would collect that data, you will produce some reports, right? And on a blue Monday, if something was wrong, you would start looking at these reports to kind of see, what was going on, the underlying, IT technology domains. I think what's going on now with observability, it's not so much a term, but I think what's really the concept that's behind it, right, is that first of all, I think we have to collect much more data nowadays, right? IT environments are becoming much more complex, right? We have now data centers, we have cloud, we have hybrid cloud, we have containerization, we have microservices, right? So there's a lot of moving parts going on. So I think we need to basically collect much more data from various large number of endpoints. The data itself, will be a combination of metrics, probably tracers, a little bit of logs, and what have you. So it becomes a heterogeneous set of data now suddenly you have to deal with. And the only way to make sense out of that increasing amount of data is to apply more intelligence, right? So with analytics, search analytics, or even ML or what have you. Right, so that piece I think is very important as well. And then I think thirdly, that's important as well, often forgotten, is why is this now so becoming important? Well, I think with cloud, what comes along with cloud is self-service capabilities, right? We enable now like application teams, right, developers to set up their own deployment environments. So what that also means is that we get more and more users that need to get access, right, to the telemetry data, just to understand, right, what has been deployed and whatsoever. So I think that's a third, kind of additional, I think, aspect that is introduced by observability, right? So more users going to use it. You're going to basically use telemetry data. And basically, it's all about, I think, making the data you collect, right, from a more complex environment actionable, right? Mm-hmm. That's in the end of the net result. And I think it's a little bit different than in the old days where it was more static reporting. I think that doesn't work anymore, right? Because I think cloud is about agility. You want to do things faster, right? But it also means you need to have kind of a real-time feedback loop to understand what has changed, what has been deployed, and what has moved. And with that instant feedback means you need to have more capabilities to aggregate the data, process the data and make sure the data, is delivered to the various end users that need it.
Yeah, I talked about this idea that there's a lot of distinction made in the marketplace around monitoring silos versus sort of an application view. But you and I talked that even for years, going back, we were implementing monitoring at the application layer and then tying it together with the underlying silos. But I think a couple of big differences we talked about is that we were mostly doing that in the data center, which was a fairly static environment, a lot less change, versus doing it in the cloud where everything's changing all the time. And you also have a pretty hard break between the application layer and the infrastructure, because that infrastructure is very fungible, right? It's moving all the time, and applications. And then you get microservices, which then, explode the number of things you're monitoring. So that was a big change from monitoring in the past. So it's more around the distinction between, what does it take to manage the data center versus the cloud. And the other big change was the audience, right? You see the rise of the site reliability engineer, in sort of modern apps, and that person as a consumer of the data, and their needs are just different than what IT ops had, right? I think we talked a bit about that as well. Maybe you can comment on that.
No, I agree. I think the concept of the new role of SREs, I think, is very interesting, right? And it's also referred to as full stack engineers. I think definitely, that's kind of a model, came from the hyperscalers, right? That are, I think, ahead of most enterprises, right? And we try to introduce these disciplines now also in, I think, traditional enterprises. I think that that definitely is an interesting trend, because that's a new type of end user. You're absolutely true. They typically need to have much deeper insight, right, throughout the stack to understand not only application runtime, right, characteristics, but also they need to understand the underlying, like Kubernetes platform, and even maybe service resources, what have you. So have, quote unquote, a full stack view. At the same time, typically it's also I think needed for like an SRE, a full stack engineer. They need to also have insight, not only kind of in a vertical way, right, full stack, but also I think across, right, domains, meaning whether it's, if it's a hybrid environment, see on-prem, off-prem, or between technology domains. So you're absolutely right. I think having these more full stack engineers, SREs, right, there is definitely driving a need for a more holistic view, right, of set of data, telemetry data that we can make accessible, right, to these types of end users. No question.
Yeah, and different technologies as well, right? Because you don't have this sort of monolithic, top to bottom, unchanging thing that you can sort of monitor as a whole thing. You have to have some technologies that can deal with the fact that all the layers are disconnected and then bring that together, right? I think there's been a rise of a whole different set of technologies as well in the observability space.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you guys definitely are, digging into this. Maybe you talk a bit about sort of the framework you guys are coming up with, and again, remember this is I like to say radio. It's not radio, of course, but it's the same idea, right? We're not putting up slides, and maybe you can walk us through the framework, some of the major building blocks, and how you guys see this fitting together.
No, I would love to. Just to give you the context, so this framework is not like try to kind of reinvent an OSI model, okay, to kind of formalize a set of capabilities, right, and functions to build the so-called observability solution. That's not what we're after. The idea is the following. I've seen also based on my own experience, quite often you see in enterprises, a lot of architects or, network management or IT architects, they typically have a set of tools, right, probably a favorite vendor, right, and you can fill in the names, right, and then basically it's like a hammer and nail kind of methodology, meaning that okay, they have their existing tools. So basically the way they try to frame the discussion about okay, how can I transform my tools, right, to kind of build an observability solution. Nothing wrong per se, but I think it's a bit unfortunate, because I think when you constrain yourself that way, I think you're missing out on a lot of important questions you need to ask. So the whole idea of this framework is just to provide guidance, right? A framework more for people that are interested, for example, to evaluate the current state of their monitoring kind of tooling, or maybe they want to build a brand new solution, or maybe they want to compare, right, vendor solutions or what have you, right? Just to give them some guiding reference, right? of areas that they probably want to explore more to really, to at least come to, in their own way, basically to kind of an SRE solution. Either they build a new one, they want to transform the existing infrastructure. And having said that, we basically came up with I think it's 5 layers, 5-layer model. And on each layer, think about it, right? Just for the listeners to visualize. Each layer is kind of building on top of the next layer, so to speak. And if you kind of start with the bottom, so that's the instrumentation layer. So those are the tools, right? Typical like agents, right? Or, libraries that really are used to generate, right? Telemetry data. It can be anything like metrics, can be logs, right? Or traces, right? Or a combination of all these 3. So a couple of things there, and that's kind of described also in the white paper, right? We just give some guidance in terms of why you probably want to look at, right? So one thing that I've dealt with in my deployment experience, both at some of my previous companies, is that quite often what you see happening is that on whether it's an OS, server OS, or what have you, it seems that there's multiple teams that all want to basically have data. Okay, like for example OS resource data. So quite often you will have 10 or 50 monitoring agents on that, and at the same time everyone's complaining that the server performance is so low, right? No surprise. Yeah. But the reason is that nobody has done that analysis to kind of really say, hey, what is the data we need to extract, right, from a particular resource? Whether it's a Kubernetes node, service node, it doesn't matter, EXX node, right? And the whole idea is hey, if you start with instrumentation first to kind of see, hey, what's out there today and what do you need? And do you have an opportunity just to kind of unify some of these collection agents? And that's actually very important, right? Instead of having 10, can you kind of, replace it by 1 or 2 agents, for example?
You're just on that topic. How does that change as you get out into the cloud? Because obviously, the whole agentry paradigm sort of evolved when you owned everything, right? The IT owned everything and could put an agent on things. You get on the cloud, it's somebody else's stuff. How do you deal with that in the cloud, basically?
Yeah, well, I good point. In the cloud, I think you have more flexibility, right? So I think one option is to, for example, to deploy your own agent, right? That's one thing. And then most cloud providers have their native, right, kind of monitoring services built in, right? If you have like a compute instance, then typically there's some sort of an API where you can pull metrics, right? And I think it's really a matter of granularity, right? Do you need to have just the base level metrics? You probably can use a standard monitoring API, but do you want to do more, which happens quite a bit? Then you probably are kind of, you have to rely on like an external agent, right? And kind of deploy it yourself, which is perfectly fine. Right, but that's kind of the instrumentation layer. There's a whole set of issues there, but it's definitely worthwhile, I think, for people to really investigate. I think the good news is that there's a lot of open source options now in terms of open source tools and agents that allow you to generate that data and integrate it into application runtimes or in Kubernetes clusters for that matter, which is I think very, very good. It gives you a lot of flexibility and options to pull data right out of your infrastructure and out of the different layers of your infrastructure. But definitely, I think quite often it's forgotten in terms of to really architect these types of software component in I think scalable way. Okay, so that's number one. The following layer is kind of natural, right? Is that so how do you collect the data? So data is being generated from different nodes, from different containers, right, or what have you, of application runtimes. Then how do you collect that, right, in a efficient way, scalable way? And then you also questions then, for example, when we were monitoring Kubernetes clusters, we had a very strict production requirement that there's always, one-to-one resiliency. So we actually had 2 streams of metrics going to 2 separate locations, right? Those are questions you need to ask. And I see quite often in production environments that people start to figure that out once everything is already deployed as an afterthought, right? It's really unfortunate. It's good to kind of think that through beforehand, right? And then the other thing I want to say here also with data collection, we see an increasing, right, kind of, I think, number of kind of SaaS-based monitoring services, which is very, very interesting. But it also requires then security, right? And how do you set up your security policies? How do you set up your firewall rules? So there's a whole bunch of things that kind of come into play to how you can optimize that, right? In a kind of a scalable way. So that's kind of the collection part. So that's the second layer. The third one is policy and control. That's all about, once I have collected the data, So where do I store it, right? Do I have one kind of repository of data, right? Of one database of data where I can collect everything, right? Which is kind of the ultimate goal, but quite often that's quite difficult, right? Case in point, whether you have your logs, your metrics, your traces, do you want to have the separate databases, or can you actually consolidate it? And then the other question comes with, okay, how long do you want to keep the data for? That's a very important question. Yeah. Right? Especially when you have these large environments, that's my personal experience as well. It's absolutely mind-boggling if you see how the volumes of terabytes of data you actually pull in every week. So you really need to have good lifecycle policies around that, because quite often you don't need, for example, you don't need to keep logs, right, from development environments more than a couple of days, right? But it's a very important question to ask, right?
My sense is, like this data aspect is pretty broad, right? It goes well beyond this because, if you're on any application, you sort of have to answer a set of questions around the data. How sensitive is the data? What's the risk of loss? I find this area one that I think most organizations do a poor job on. Is that sort of your experience as well? That this is sort of is often just completely not an area people focus on in terms of the whole data. What data do I have? How do I control it? How do I manage it? Well, it seems to be.
Now, David, I think you're spot on. Let me give you an anecdote. I've seen that typically this becomes an important issue after the first real production outage, right? Because then suddenly, you see that end users start to realize that they need to have certain data to do troubleshooting, right, and post-mortem analysis. And quite often or not, the discovery is that certain data is not available, or it's not easily accessible, right? So I think the whole idea of this framework, what we're trying to do is hopefully help, right, end users, give them some guidelines to think through these, I think very important architecture aspects beforehand, right? But you're absolutely right. That's my experience as well. This whole notion of how do you manage the data, right? And one thing I didn't mention yet, but it's also how long you want to keep the data for, but also who can access what data. Very important.
Yep.
Yeah, for me watching this play out and having run a data center for a while in my career, it's like there's three trends here that I just see that are making this even more. One is security, right? And and the fact that we have organizations around the globe that are trying to come in and blackmail companies. So the idea of actually being able to keep track of this becomes really important. That's one trend, right? That you just can't be like, well, because we went down, we need to go fix it. It's also a security paradigm that starts to play here. And then modern applications also, just like it has become more complicated, right? It used to be you'd have somebody deliver software, install it, and that you ran that, and you could have siloed applications because that's how they were developed. But now with modern apps, that just makes the problem 10 times worse. And then the hybrid nature of the cloud and cloud services that are coming from everywhere. It just seems like these three are like a perfect storm that if you don't have an architecture in place, you're just gonna be impossible to operate a data center.
Yeah. No, fair point. And just to add, I think, Eric, in my experience is that typically a lot of these issues are only addressed after something
right,
bad happens. It becomes a forcing factor. And, of course, then it's crisis mode, unfortunately, right? And for ideas that, hey, if you do some more forward-looking thinking right ahead of time, you can hopefully prevent at least some of them, right? That's the idea. And just to finish up, I think that framework, right? So we were talking about the instrumentation, the data collection, and then you have the policies and the controls, right? So the fourth layer is really the analytics, right? Meaning, so how are you going to use the data? I think there's a lot of very interesting technology out there that can do search analytics, right? Obviously, want to plug Tensor Observability Wavefront that I'm using extensively. But it gives you a lot of advanced capabilities to look at these very complex data sets, right? And it's important, I think, to really think through in terms of how you want to use the data. And I think interesting, and now we see finally a little bit, machine learning is starting to come. I think it's personally, I think it's still pretty far out, but it's good to start thinking about that, right? How do you want to use the data? And finally, right, the top layer, right, the end users, right? At the end of the day, who's actually going to use it? And one thing that I've seen, right, so for example, it used to be like, applications, right, and it was operations. And now actually suddenly you see that whole scope basically diverging, meaning that it's not just one infrastructure team, right? You have, of course, maybe a server team, you have then a Kubernetes platform team, capacity management team, right? This is, of course, security team, right? So before you know it, you have 5 or 6 different, basically key stakeholders that all need access to the data, right? But different types of purposes. And more importantly, also on the application side, it's not just like application team, right? You will have a developer team that probably wants to look at something. You have the test team, right? And then you have the production deployment team, and you have probably a production support team, right? So right there, you already have 10 kind of stakeholders that are interested in data, right?
Yeah.
So it's very good to not only have a bottoms-up approach, but also have these conversations, right, with these end users. So, hey, what data do you need? What reporting do you need, and what have you, right? So,
yeah, this strikes me. That's like when we started, we were talking about the differences between monitoring and observability, and these top 2 layers really seem to me are sort of the key to sort of the new paradigm of observability. Because when you get into the analytics, this is where you talked about tools like Wavefront. I mean, there's orders of magnitude differences in the scale that people are dealing with at that layer than in the past, and so you need a completely new set of technologies, and there are a brand new set of technologies around that space. And then, as you said, you've got an explosion in the end users as well, where before it would have been a one IT ops team kind of consuming all this stuff. Now you've got all these different teams, and they all have different capabilities and different requirements, and so that's very different as well.
Yeah, and maybe one final thing here. But we also discussed this notion of SLOs, right? It's kind of one of those terms that I think really has become very popular as part of the observability discussion and SRE discussion, actually. But the whole idea is that, hey, we're getting more and more data, right? And we all have our day jobs, and you just don't have the time anymore, right, to kind of look at this data, even if you want, maybe for troubleshooting, but just on a regular day. You just want to have some sort of high-level metrics, right? That's literally what I did in my organization as well, right? That then, whatever you manage, right, that you have a couple of high-level metrics you can look at, right, as a discussion point, and also kind of track, right? So, hey, are we good, or we're not good, right? So I think this notion of abstraction, right, and formalize it in mutual agreed on type of, service objective is a little bit more fancy word to it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's becoming increasingly important. You need to have that abstraction level. Otherwise, you just get so much data and it's just not actionable anymore, right? So
yeah. So another thing in the white paper you talked about was, you sort of make this really kind of real by talking about use cases and personas, and maybe you can kind of highlight some of that work as well. That just sort of brings this to life, the framework to life.
Yeah, it's what I mentioned before. I think it's about who is using a lot of the telemetry data, and that's going to be different for, I think, multiple different teams, right? And to kind of keep that in mind, I think design, your architecture, right? The monitoring and data collection architecture. And one thing we've seen, for example, if you do things like capacity planning, you do trending analysis of data sets, and typically you don't need to have 1 minute granularity necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
But if I'm a trading operations team, right, I probably want to have 1 second, frequency of certain metrics, right? So when you start building your system, you just don't know that beforehand, right? So and that's the reason why I think it's very important to kind of define, right? In the white paper I mentioned personas. It's kind of a way how you can define these different user profiles, right? And that's, I think, very important, because it's more top-down approach, but it's important because that will drive, I think, a lot in terms of how you start kind of fine-tuning your system in terms of frequency, how much of the type of data you collect, but also the frequency of data and how long you store data. At the end of the day, it should serve a specific, user group. Otherwise, you shouldn't even, basically collect the data in the first place, right? So that's the reason why I mention it, and that's covered, right? And clearly, there's different personas. If you look at typical enterprise, it's typically, you have architecture, you have then support, and of course operations. And you see that I think a lot of the lines of these organizations are blurring, right?
Mm-hmm.
And traditionally, clearly we had more siloed organizations. I think to some extent that's going away. Although I think you will always have some, may not be explicit, but certainly implicit silos between different teams, right? And I think it's good to kind of understand that, because that will also have an impact in terms of what data needs to be delivered, right? And how you, for example, establish SLO between teams and what have you.
Yeah, it strikes me that sort of that's the key to everything, right? Is sort of understanding the personas in those use cases, because that goes all the way down to, okay, what do I instrument? What analytics do I need to run on that data? What are the data policies I need to put in place? As you said, because based on those use cases, do I need to have this data for 45 days? Do I need it for, just like the last stream? And, assuming nothing happened, I don't need it anymore. It sort of drives a lot of the architecture you have to put in place around a solution in this space.
Yeah, and maybe one thing to add, David, there as well, and I think that's a bit of a missed opportunity, but and one often overlooked persona is senior management, right?
Mm-hmm.
So quite often what happens is that, if you run your IT shop well, nothing happens, right? And of course, you don't hear from senior management up to a point that, there is some sort of major outage, and then you need to present all kinds of data, right?
Mm-hmm.
And a bit unfortunate, right? So one thing, and we started to do some of that as well, but I think there's a lot of opportunities there. It would be very helpful if, with all this data you collect, you also extract certain, high-level metrics that you can just share, right, with your senior management, right? Clearly, it's going to be more high level, but just to kind of create more awareness, not necessarily when something goes wrong, but also awareness to, for example, of usage of IT infrastructure, right? Number of upgrades of infrastructure.
Right.
I think it's being overlooked, which is kind of a missed opportunity, right?
That makes sense. You want to be able to demonstrate that things are going well because IT is doing its job, not just because they're not needed.
Exactly. I think there's a lot of opportunity in that space. I'm certainly very interested in that, because I think at the end of the day, what's very hard is to translate, right, the value of core IT to senior management, right? And I think with some of the data, you have an opportunity to at least do that, right? So.
Yeah, I thought the white paper really does a great job talking about observability and sort of what you need to do and to architect a solution. So I think it's a nice piece, nice addition to the thinking around observability. You guys end the white paper by talking about sort of what is the state of observability, kind of as a concept and as market adoption. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, and we can bridge to sort of how people get a hold of things and what's coming next for you guys.
Yeah. Okay. Absolutely, Dave. I just want to, I think, mention 4, I think, specific items. I'm pretty sure there are more, but at least for me, that what comes to mind is, I think there's much more awareness about the need for collecting metrics and data from your IT infrastructure and application estate, right? Just to be able to handle that. But also, I think at the same time, what I see across the industry, it becomes a little bit more now also clear that, hey, monitoring or observability, for that matter, is really a big data problem, right? And increasingly, part of your architecture, part of your solution, probably have to include some big data tooling or analytics, just to kind of be able to manage effectively. And I see that also across the industry. I see a lot of vendors, right, product vendors, that basically try to kind of work towards an approach, right? So meaning it's not just like, I collect logs or metrics. No, I need to collect multiple streams of data and then basically have a big data approach to really make sense out of it and make it actionable. I think that awareness is in there. I think we're beyond just a buzzword. So definitely, I think more and more this is becoming a mainstream, I think, solution component, right? When you talk about cloud adoption, for example. The other thing, and I touched on that already, which I think is very encouraging. You see a lot of open source options now for telemetry instrumentation, which I think is a great thing. Especially it gives, I think, end user options, right, and different ways how you can extract data, right, metrics and log data out of different layers of the IT infrastructure. And I think it's a good thing. I think more data is better, right? And I think if you can do it in a flexible, right, and scalable way using any of these open source tools, I think that's a very good improvement. Now, thirdly, I think SaaS first, that's certainly a big theme for VMware, but I think you see that across the industry, right? That more and more of the monitoring solutions are being offered to end users as a SaaS-based offering, right? For good reasons, right? From a commercial perspective, but also I think from a overall support perspective, right? So, but I think it will have an impact also on a lot of enterprises, right? In terms of how they can consume it. And it's not always applicable, but definitely you see more and more SaaS-based offering. And sometimes it complements, right, more traditional software product offerings, right? But definitely a trend I think we have seen certainly the last year or two. And then the other thing is there's a concept that's being mentioned quite a lot. It's moving to the left, right? Try to kind of build more intelligence, right, up front, right, and make that part of the deployment. And I don't think, of observability is no exception, right? I think more and more you see that observability is being treated as a first-class citizen, right? So when you deploy an application runtime, when you deploy a Kubernetes cluster or virtualization infrastructure or cloud service, right, that at day one, you have basically a stream of metrics and other telemetry data built in, right? Instead of having to kind of, install any of these capabilities as day to operation, which was typically the case. I think see more and more that it's now coming out of the box, which I think is exactly where we need to head out to. Okay. Now, two other things maybe for the future, where I think we are going, it will take some time, but we've been talking about analytics, right? Analytics that basically apply to collect the telemetry data. Specifically in the Kubernetes space, there's some interesting trends where you see these intelligent controllers, right? Think like autoscalers, right? And the idea is that, instead of, collecting data and sending it to a centralized point, you can actually just send it to a controller that's running in a Kubernetes cluster, for example, and have that controller start making decisions, right? Spinning up more pods or resizing pods or what have you, right? So basically try to push that intelligence within the kind of Kubernetes infrastructure. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there for innovation. Clearly, telemetry is kind of implied, but nevertheless, I think it's a very interesting trend there. So it's like SRE as a service. That's a way you can look at it. And the other one I think is more about, I think, forward-looking, right? Predictive capabilities. I think we're getting pretty good at kind of advanced analytics to troubleshoot things, to figure out, to correlate, failure events, to figure out, what happened exactly. But obviously, the ideal world is that you can be a little bit more proactive, right? That you can do more trend analysis. So you can actually predict that at some point the potential for some failure scenario and actually start acting on that, right? I think we're still pretty far out, but I think that's another, big thing that will come our way sooner or later.
Cool. Sounds like a very interesting set of things that are going to come about.
Right. David,
go ahead.
Yeah, I have a couple, just one or two comments here that might throw at Harmen here, which is one, if you're in this, all right, so you can go listen to vendor pitches, I guess, in these things. Is there like conferences, or is there like a collection of people that get together and, have discussions around these type of things? Like, is there events, or do you have to kind of go to like a VMworld and just watch for sessions? Where are people actually having these conversations around open source technologies and other solutions that you as an architect here could start to get your head around?
That's a fair point. Good point. I think something like a KubeCon, right? And there's also KubeCon is one, QCon is another one. So there's a couple of select conferences. They are not necessarily observability conferences, but they certainly, I think, have typically a set of observability topics in there. So you have more application, right? So KubeCon obviously is Kubernetes, and clearly there's a big track, theme for observability. Yeah? Case in point, Prometheus, Fluentd. There's a whole slew of these interesting tools out there that we also use heavily, right? In the QCon, I think it's more like an application-based focus conference. So think about the Spring Framework, right? Where we've been leading a set of efforts there as well, right? Dependency projects related to tracing, for example. Right, so that kind of comes to mind from my perspective in terms of where you can really have these conversations. I'm not aware of one single forum, unfortunately.
Right.
On the other hand, I think it's another way to look at it, and that is, I think more and more observability, monitoring for that matter, is becoming more an integral component of whatever technology, whether it's the Kubernetes space, whether it's application space, instead of being a standalone discipline, right? And maybe that's a good thing, right? And because I think that's where we need to get to. Needless to say, there's a lot of, each vendor nowadays, there's a lot of vendors out there, interesting vendors, I have to say, right? That have their own, right, conferences, but clearly sometimes there's naturally some bias, right, to a specific product or solution.
Okay, so the next one, my second follow-up, and then I'll give it back to David, is have you seen anybody do this really well? And what are the kind of key takeaways that you've seen where they've done it well? And on the flip side, have you seen somebody do it really bad? And what were the key things we should avoid? So what were the two good practices and two bad practices that you would fall into?
Yeah, this is a tricky answer. Of a tricky question. It's a good
without
question.
throwing anybody under the bus.
Yeah.
No names.
I tend
Except for the good ones.
What my team did at Citigroup, I'm still proud of, and I do think that was a good thing. I won't say that set the standard for the whole industry, no question. No, I think clearly the hyperscalers, right? I think they have clearly set a standard in terms of how you can build, I think, observability capabilities, right, at scale, right, and for full stack monitoring. Now, I think the only flip side there is, I think I mentioned early in the beginning, the difference is in a hyperscaler is you have a handful of applications at a very, very large scale, clearly a very difficult problem. You have the reverse problem in a typical large enterprise, meaning you have smaller size applications, but you have a lot of them, thousands of them, right? So there, the challenge you have is not necessarily the scale, but it's the diversity of applications and teams, and how can you come up with a streamlined approach, right, to build these observabilities there, capabilities there. And it comes back to, I think, your second part. Okay, who's doing it hasn't done it very effectively, to say it in a politically correct way. I think I've seen a lot of enterprises that are still struggling a little bit to really kind of implement a more holistic kind of observability solution. And the reason, I think, is, as typically is the case, there's a lot of legacy tools out there. And there's still, I think, with it comes, the alignment with specific, teams or organizations, and they all want to kind of, grasp their own kind of little tools. And I think it's just a very difficult conversation and also journey, right, to kind of at least have a conversation about, hey, we don't need to have 10 different tools, right, to collect the same things. We can just basically collect, have one single unified tool, right, collected once, stored in one centralized, policy controlled kind of infrastructure, and make it available whoever needs it, right? I think that's a long journey, and it will take time. So I'm not going to call out any specific companies, but I can only imagine any company with a huge legacy of tooling vendors out there will have a struggle, and it will take time to kind of evolve it into a more normalized kind of observability data collection architecture. Right. So.
That makes sense. And I guess with Kubernetes being a big refactor kind of event, this might be a good time for, a company that is starting to refactor apps to really take a look at this framework and try to put something in place as you start to refactor apps, so that things slot into that.
No, yeah, absolutely. And that's a good segue. And that's also what we did. Clearly, you cannot change the world overnight. But you're absolutely right. Kubernetes gives you a nice entry point, at least for those new environments. Try to do it right? Try to normalize on the tools, right, and how you collect and manage data. You're absolutely right, and that's what we did as well. And I've seen that as well, and I think that's a good opportunity to get started. No question.
Right.
Cool. So, Harmen, how can folks learn more about what you guys are doing? I mean, there's a white paper, or is there anything else? And
yeah. So the white paper is very simple. I think for the audio use, attendees, just type in Octo Observability Framework, 3 separate words. That will bring you to the Octo VMware website, and there you see the blog, and you can just download the white paper. Certainly interested to hear feedback and what have you. Secondly, we, together with the Tanso observability team, the Wavefront team, we did a session for actually a lot of people in VMworld. And the session ID is Octo 3016. So OC Charlie OT. So Octo 33016. And you can just go to the vmworld.com. Pull it out from there. And then, thirdly, I'm certainly planning some additional blogs and what have you. So definitely check out, the blogs by Octo, right? And you can learn more.
And if people want to become a fan of Harmen, are you on Twitter? And I see that you've got other, if I Google you, I see other white papers out there as well. So might be somebody we want to follow.
I appreciate it. I do post typically on LinkedIn. So definitely that's probably a good starting point. Twitter, I still need to kind of get used to, so to speak. But I will start using that a little bit more. But for now, just stick with LinkedIn.
LinkedIn is great. A lot of people use LinkedIn for exactly this type of content, so it's good.
For any, at least any announcements of any publication, I always post it there. And that's probably good.
And if you're listening to this on SoundCloud, I'll spell his name for you. It's Harmen VanderLinde. So there you go. You can look for him on LinkedIn and give him a follow and check out his papers. Pretty nice.
Cool.
All right. Well, it's been great having you, Harmen. Good catching up with you. Always fun to talk.
Very nice. It was a pleasure. Thanks for the invite, Eric. Very nice meeting you. Stay in touch.
Yep. Thanks a lot. Yep.
All right. Thanks, everyone.